Hi girls. I know that there were kind of a lot of questions today about chapters 5 through 8, and that really always happens when we read kind of a large chunk in Wuthering Heights, because let's face it, like there is so much stuff going on in this novel. But so many of you have been sick, and I hate that for you, and I know how stressed out you are about coming back and trying to get everything caught up. So I thought that I would just take a quick moment, now that my family is finally out of the house, to kind of run through some of the big pieces of chapters 5 through 8. So this might be a little bit of a longer video. I thought about breaking it up into specific chapters, but then I just thought, it all bleeds into one another. So we'll just kind of start from the beginning. So starting in chapter 5, we hear a little bit about the start of Catherine and Heathcliff's relationship. One of the things that's always surprised me is that Heathcliff, for as gruff and aggressive and kind of dominant as he appears to be in those early chapters with Lockwood in chapters 1 through 3, in his childhood, he's actually rather submissive. We heard about at the end of chapter 4, that he was willing to take the abuse from Hindley and from Nellie, as long as it ended up, helping him get what he wanted. And I think that we see that again in chapter 5 with Catherine and with his relationship to Catherine. That he really lets her call the shots, and he follows her lead in whatever, mischievous scheme she comes up with. He kind of follows along. Nellie tells us that his greatest punishment her greatest punishment is to be separated from him, and that Catherine was much too wild and much too reckless, and that Nellie even says that she can't really love Catherine as a child, that she's just altogether too much. Heathcliff seems to tame that a little bit. I think he provides much needed companionship for Catherine. Remember, Hindley is off to school. He's 8 years older than Catherine to begin with. She doesn't have any other close playmates around. Remember, they're in this very isolated setting. Her mother is dead. Her mother dies when she's 8. Remember, 2 years after Heathcliff arrives. And so she's very isolated, and I think she's very lonely, and I really think she kind of finds that kindred spirit in Heathcliff. There's that interesting interaction with Mr. Earnshaw right before he dies, where she asks her father, where her father asks her, why can you not be good? And she replies right back and says, no, why can't you be a good man? And so I think we see there a little bit of her sauciness, her bravado, her sass. She gives as good as she gets. She is certainly wild, and she is certainly untamed. And I think Heathcliff helps to temper some of that. When Mr. Earnshaw dies and Nellie finds them together, and they are just clinging to one another, and they are sobbing. And in fact, Nellie, it's actually kind of awkward, because Nellie's like, I felt like I shouldn't, be watching, that this was, something between the two of them, that they were mourning him in private. I think we also see the depth of emotion that Catherine is capable of, even at a young age. But I mean, like, think of Catherine, and think of Heathcliff at the end of chapter 5. Mr. and Mrs. Earnshaw are dead. Okay, so their guardians, their parental figures are gone. They're in this isolated setting. Hindley, in chapter 6 comes back, but he's been away for so long, and he's so much older, and he hates Heathcliff so much, and he brings with him this wife that, Frances, it says, has very high hopes that she is going to have this great relationship with Catherine, and it takes about 2 weeks, and she's like, nope, this girl, not my people, like, I'm done. And then they Frances and Hindley just kind of take on those roles of almost tormentors for these two. And we remember that, right? Because we remember back in chapter 3, reading the letter, or reading the diary entry that Catherine writes that Lockwood finds. And we hear, of Hindley and Frances tormenting Heathcliff and Catherine so much. So I think that in chapter 6, when they first make their way over to Thrushcross Grange, and there's been a jump in time, certainly, but when they first make their way over there, I think, they're very intrigued by what they find, because what they find is a family unit, a functioning family unit that they have never experienced, right? They have never ever experienced anything like this. And I think they're both very kind of like, I don't really know what to do with that. So if you go to, I think it's page 48, check me, but I think it's page 48. And Heathcliff takes over narration there. So we've got like this third layer of the frame narrative, right? Because we've got Lockwood, and then we've got Nellie, and then Nellie's telling us everything that Heathcliff told us because Nellie wasn't there. So we have to rely on Heathcliff's narration here to understand what happens at Thrushcross Grange. So, when Heathcliff begins and he says, "Don't cant, Nellie," Catherine and I were, running a race. She's barefoot. And again, I mean, like you kind of have to scratch your head and go, who's looking after this poor child? She's running all over the fields in northern England barefoot. It proves her to be uncivilized. It proves her to be, this very primitive being. And in fact, I think the next couple of verbs that are used, he says, we crept through a broken hedgegrove and we groped our way up to the window and then we planted ourselves. Crept and groped, they're very animalistic. These two are just running wild. They are just no supervision whatsoever. And then he begins to describe the physical structure of Thrushcross Grange. And oh my God, what a difference, right? Like ridiculous amount of difference between this house and Wuthering Heights. This house, Heathcliff tells us that the shutters had not been drawn and the curtains were only half closed. It's open. There is light flooding in. What a huge difference from Wuthering Heights, right? And then he goes on, and there's so much color imagery, and the crimson tablecloths, and the crimson chairs, and the pure white ceiling bordered in gold, and the silver, chains, and there's so much light imagery, and the glistening, and the glass drops, and the tapers that were lit. And this is a place of life, right? Like that's how we can begin to really see this. This is a place of life. This is a place that that is just so drastically different than what their experience has been. And if you look at his tone, right, if you look at Heathcliff's voice and you get so many of these beautiful interjections, like, it was beautiful, and it's set apart by dashes. And then he says it's a splendid place. So if you combine, looking at the imagery and then looking at the syntax and the diction, the tone or the attitude that's really coming across is just one of like awe. I mean, he's just in awe of this building. Somebody said in class today, it's almost like he idolizes this house. And I think that's a great word for it. He's put this house up on a pedestal of like, oh my God, this is what a house can look like? And I always equate it to, if you've ever been to a friend's house for the first time and you've never been there before and you walk in, you're like, oh, okay, didn't realize this is what we're dealing with. Like, whoa, this is pretty major. Like that's kind of the feeling that he has, like, where am I? And then just as quickly, the tone shifts, because then he starts to describe Edgar and Isabella Linton, right? And he says, that they're fighting over this dog. And then, and I love this exclamation from his voice, the idiots. And I always kind of picture Dwight from The Office whenever he says idiot. And I always like that. So he calls them idiots. And he's so critical of them. And he's like, we did despise them. And they were petted things. And they were so awful. And there's definitely a shift in his tone, right? It becomes aggressive. It becomes annoyed. But I think the the subtext of that, underneath all of that, is jealousy. Because Edgar Linton has something that Heathcliff has never experienced and probably at this point has no hope of ever having. And so I think underneath quite a bit of that, And he ends that speech, he ends that passage on such a violent tone. I wouldn't trade my life with Edgar Linton's, not for 1,000 years, not if you told me that I could fling Joseph from the highest gable and paint the house front with Hindley's blood. I mean, it's like, whoa, that escalated quickly. He ends on this very violent, aggressive note. Now, notice that what he's describing are actions. And remember, we've talked about Heathcliff and actions before. So he's talking to us there certainly about his actions, but they're violent. I mean, they're so aggressive. It seems to come out of nowhere, but it's that build of jealousy, right? It's that complete build of being jealous and recognizing that Catherine's now there. And, kind of that insecurity too. Like, she's there, she's not with me. You notice that he continually uses the pronoun we. We did despise them. We thought they were foolish. And when he says we, he means him and Catherine. Because in Heathcliff's mind, he can't fathom a situation where he and Catherine wouldn't feel the same way. Right? Like, in his mind, everything that he feels, obviously Catherine feels. We're so close. We always see things the same way. We always think of things in exactly the same way. So it's just improbable to him that Catherine might actually like being there, that she might end up enjoying Edgar's company. Like, that isn't even in his realm of existence at this point. And that's what makes chapter 7 kind of worse, right? He's sitting here thinking, oh my God, this poor girl, she's there for 5 weeks. She must hate it. She probably can't wait to leave. And of course, as we learn, that's not the case. There were so many questions today about why she ended up having to stay. And I want to remind you that, she does get bit by their dog, by Skulker. And then Mrs. Linton goes the next day to Wuthering Heights to talk to Hindley. And when she goes to Wuthering Heights, I think she discovers the house just in an absolutely deplorable condition, right? Like, horrible, horrible living conditions. They've got just one servant. They've got Nellie working. They've got Hindley, who's drunk most of the time. I mean, just really, really bad conditions. And she kind of fusses at him. And then Mr. Linton goes and does the same thing and really, like, rebukes him. And it's like, you can't raise your family in this way. So I think the reason that they end up keeping her for so long isn't because she can't walk. I mean, it's a dog bite. But more because they want to take care of her, right? Like, they want to make sure that she's okay, that she's being raised in an appropriate environment. So I realized I said that I was going to do chapters 5 through 8 in this video. It's 13 minutes long right now. So sorry about that, but I do hope that it was helpful. I will come back on in the next one and we'll talk about chapters 7 and 8.